I think we're going to talk about it today, but if we could get there, um, how the vocal tract, region 3 and region 2 interact, okay? We're going to get a little bit more into that today. So, go ahead.
I have two more questions.
No, that's good. I like them.
The first one is how come or at least this might have been the way Libby listed it, but how come the respiratory system is 1 and like our head is 3?
3. That's just how we have labeled it over, like historically. And I think it probably that's just me theorizing, but I think it comes from the ideology that we usually start with support ideologies, like your first lessons or your first choir rehearsals when talking about technique are usually about, okay, everyone sit on the edge of your chair and give me a nice, tall, long posture. And those posture elements are directly related to how we breathe, right? So when we talk about support more later, we're going to talk about the disposition of space and how we can position our bodies to breathe differently. So everybody can stand up. Let's play with this just real quick. So later in the semester, we're going to talk about the German school. We're going to talk about the German school, Italian school, French school, and the British school. And I've mentioned the British school is really important for choral music educators because that's the root of the vocal approach that was taught and used in boy choirs and all of that. So one of the biggest things we do as English speakers is we sometimes confuse the Italian school with the German school. Okay, so we're going to do some German school things, and I want Shel to tell me where you feel that breath, and then we're going to do some Italian school things, which most of you are familiar with Italian school. Okay, so let's start. We're going to put our hands on our hips, and we're going to start with the Italian school. So one thing with the Italian school is you feel your booty go back towards the back wall, and you extend your chest wall high. Many of the Italians said a noble posture. So the sternum is very high, and you breathe in this posture. So go and take a deep breath. We're going to talk about a guy named Manuel Garcia, and he used to make all of his students stand with their hands behind their back and their arms extended back. So there's no motion of the chest wall, and we're just feeling probably an expansion in this region. Everybody take deep breaths here. Very good. So how many of you feel that kind of sense of it's a little bit lower? For some of you with your body types, you might start to feel it encourage something a little higher. So we're going to play with some different postures, okay? So now hands back on the hips. So that was your Italian school. The Germans talk about something called Stauprinzip, and they also do Bauch-Außenstütze. So I'm going to show you what Bauch-Außenstütze looks like. So this is belly out breathing, and they feel even an expansion for some people in what they'll call the pelvic floor. Have you ever had a voice teacher talk about the pelvic floor and feeling that release? That's very Germanic, okay? So with this is a little harder for cisgender males to get used to because we tend to societally lock our hips when we walk, and we don't get that hip mobility that a lot of cisgender females do. So what you want to do with this is you're actually going to, instead of your booty out towards the back wall, is you're going to try to bring your hips forward and rock them forward. Does everybody see that motion? Yeah? So you're actually tucking your hips in. Yeah? So, and you feel your hips squared over your shoulder blades, and take a deep breath there. And this is another way you might feel even a lower sense of breath with this. Good. So now I want the class, this is the fun part, is we embrace diversity in vocal pedagogy, okay? And part of this comes with understanding that we have different body sizes, and some of us have wide hips, some of us have slender hips, some of us have broad chests, some of us have narrow chests, some of us are very slender in the middle, some of us got a little extra on the sides, like myself, okay? So I want you to try them back to back, and then I want the class to tell me where you feel like you get the most breath, okay? So this is about, on the inhalation, feeling the most range of motion. So let's start with Bauch-Außenstütze. So you bring that in, take a deep breath there. breaths. And feel the full range of motion of that breath. And then let's go to the Italian. Booty back and chest up. Take a deep breath there. And go back to the Bauchhalsumstütze. And there's no wrong answer with this. Both of these channel energy away from the muscles that we don't want. Last time we talked about the SEM and some of these other muscles. So raise your hands if you felt, there's no like wrong answer. Did you feel more range of motion? You felt more range of motion and more freedom with the Italian approach. So you felt a little more? Yeah?
So I really did much, so we'll see. I felt
And which one is Garocia's approach?
The Italian is high chest wall with your booty kind of back towards the back wall. Yeah. So both of you felt more expansion with that. Yeah. Yeah. And you felt a little bit more release with or which one?
Well, I wasn't like raising my hand or anything.
Oh, okay.
But I was going to say that with the Italian version, I felt more release with my chest. I felt like it was easier to breathe in through my rib cage. But with the Bauchhalsumstütze, I felt like it was more easier to breathe through the back and through the stomach.
So you felt a little bit more of a lower sense.
Yes.
Which one did you feel more range of motion, or did they feel about the same?
It felt about the same.
That's okay. That's
it was
all right.
just in different places.
Totally. That's good. That's exactly what I was talking about with disposition of space. I repositioned my body in a different way and felt the breath in a different way. Yeah, that's good. How many of you felt more range of motion and like freedom of breath in the Germanic approach? Almost all the cisgender females in this room. Yeah, and I've noticed that pretty consistently across the board when I do this class. Is almost all of the cisgender females with their body types feel more range of motion and a better sense of support when they're doing more of the Germanic Bauchhalsumstütze. Kind of fun? Yeah, so take a seat. So both of these breathing approaches are in the yes, this is okay when it comes to vocal pedagogy and voice health and science. I don't know why, but my computer's like super dead, so we might be headed. There she goes. I don't know what just happened. Okay, maybe it's time to get a new computer.
So I noticed that when I was doing the Italian, like it was hard to breathe. Like it wasn't.
You felt more resistance.
Yeah, I felt like a ton of resistance. Like I couldn't get air past my lungs.
Wow. Well, this is really good to express to your teacher, you know?
Yeah.
When you feel like you go into these positions and it's like, I feel so much resistance. Now, I have noticed that people who do a lot of running or they're very athletic, the rectus abdominis gets very tight. And this is normal. I have a really good friend of mine. He owns 2 gyms in LA, and he has a master's in vocal performance, and he gives presentations to singers that want to be buff and be singers at the same time. And one of the things that we have as a challenge is the development of the rectus abdominis and that getting really tight as you're running or you're athletic, you're an MT, you're doing dance all the time. And that can get the rectus abdominis tight. When you go into the Bauchhalsumstütze position, you're actually creating slack in the rectus abdominis. So when you're here, it's like a rope has been. Did you feel that kind of sense of like a rope right across the front? And you couldn't get expansion in the front. When you moved your hips forward, you actually created a release in the rectus abdominis that allowed you to feel a little bit more breath.
Intriguing. Okay.
Yeah. And again, you might be working with a teacher that might be like, I don't like Bauchhalsumstütze, that sort of thing. But if we look at it just from a health and longevity standpoint, there's nothing wrong with either of these breath management ideologies. Go ahead.
Concerning the French school, I take French and I'm near fluent.
Cool.
And so I'm very interested in anything French.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask, is there a difference between the French, and there may not even be a French method of breathing.
There is.
Is there a difference between the Italian and the German schools versus the French?
Sure. So the guy I talked about earlier, Manuel Garcia, he is considered, ironically, Garcia Spanish, right? but he was taught and sang the Italian approach, and he was hired at the French Conservatoire in the 1800s and influenced the French school based off of the Italian ideologies. One of my former students last semester came, he did his doctorate and he did his dissertation on French pedagogy. And he gave a lecture for the class about what we know about French pedagogy. Initially, Richard Miller toured all of these countries in the 80s and early 70s and interviewed and worked with French teachers and things like that and came up with an ideology. Generally, there's some Italian influence, but there's a stronger influence on ideologies of speech and language and a little bit more of a relaxed body. So there's a lot of like release and freedom sensations associated with breath, okay? And we're gonna get more into it as the semester goes along about what they believed. And I can, if you're really curious, I can give you his PowerPoint and you can dig into those French pedagogues. But he's getting published in the Journal of Singing in the next year with the French pedagogy stuff. So we're still learning more about French pedagogy, so that's a really good question. But generally the French had a much more, you'll hear French singers talk a lot about like being singing actresses and actors. The French really believe in like putting the voice in a range that allows the text to be paramount. So whatever that takes, they're willing to do. Does that make sense? It's all, people need to understand the words and I need to be a great actor, actress. And this also goes into opera and operetta and that sort of thing. So we'll talk more about it. Other questions? Go ahead.
And one, thinking of like a Tim Seeley video I've seen before, like choral warm-ups, things like that.
Sure.
Things he would do with his choirs, things like that. And he talked, and it's sort of a combination of the German and the Italian.
Sure.
Because he talked about this sort of open chest kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
and then he kind of highlighted the slight hip rotation rocking forward.
Okay.
And then he had like, well, because he was an opera singer, and then he's like opera singer friends. When I asked them about singing high notes or long phrases, they all like, because a lot of them say that's very important breathing wise.
They'll start to rock the hips forward.
Do you get? I'm trying to get away from asking permission to try different things, but it's almost like, is that a common thing, sort of combinations of the different breathing techniques?
Absolutely,
like that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I teach them all is so that you have an understanding of them all, and then you can play in your own technique or with your students of where you're, as teachers, I've been teaching for about 25 years, and you start to notice like, oh, all of my cisgender females, or most of them, seem to really like pelvic tilt and pelvic floor type breathing. So you start to notice like, oh, these body types tend to need this and that sort of thing. And I encourage some of my students, you may have seen Alice's, she's doing a study with cisgender females and water space in the mouth and the mouth of the space. So I encourage all the students with their master's thesis, DMA thesis and dissertations to explore some of these ideologies of like different body types and that sort of thing. So we do a lot of experimenting and human testing, all the good things. But the reason why last time I focused so much on the muscles is because when you're working with singers, you want to make sure that wherever you put them, that you're not activating muscles like the sternocleidomastoid that can lead to pathologies, the geniohyoid, the mylohyoid, okay? So you might, put a student into a position where you go, oh, this is what I'm supposed to put them in, and then their body reacts with more tension or I can't breathe in those postures, and you as the teacher have to go, okay, how can I make this adjustment and still be under the umbrella of health and longevity? Question?
Because I also know opera is very prevalent in the Czech Republic and
Sure.
in Russia.
Yeah.
And generally just in any country, do they have their own styles of breathing technique, or do they all take after like a couple or maybe 3 different styles?
They're mostly all under the umbrella of maybe not a national school, but some sort of combination of what we've talked about. Dorsal, back, so you've got your upper back and your lower back, you've got intercostal raised rib, you've got diaphragmatic. It can be some sort of combination of many of them. Mostly the schools differ less on how we breathe and more on how they produce colors and sounds. So like in the in the Russian school or many Czech, like base Slavic languages, you'll see a lot of what's called buccal rounding, where they pucker out a lot. If you watch, you're a baritone.
Yes.
If you watch Dmitry Forostovsky,
yes,
you'll notice that he does an outward pucker, and this is really common within the Russian school. Unfortunately, this semester we're only focusing on German, Italian, French, but we could probably have a whole class on studying the different nations and whatnot, and I study specifically Spanish, so I've been digging into like Latin approaches. Yeah, and I don't know if you ever heard of zarzuela. I collect zarzuela, which is kind of like operas and musical theater. They're like a midpoint between the two, and they're done all throughout Latin America. Yeah. Another question.
And then also, as a vocal teacher, what amongst the different styles of breathing would you recommend?
I like the diversity. So I'm really digging into the fact that like our bodies are built so differently. So I tend to gravitate more towards like Germanic and Italian approaches for breathing, but ultimately I'm searching for the fullest range of motion of the inhale, so where the student feels like they can really get a full breath and not feel tightness on the inhale. There's a number of great pedagogues that have advocated for that. Some of my like teacher idols over the years that I gravitate towards. Oh, they've got a lot of great students. One of them is Beverly Johnson, who taught Jerry Hadley, who is a super famous tenor, Renee Fleming. Beverly Johnson taught a ton of really famous singers that had crazy long phrase length. So when I was younger and I was like, oh, they all studied with Beverly Johnson, I'm going to go study Beverly Johnson technique and try to understand. And one of her biggest ideologies was that on the inhale, your body should feel very little muscular resistance. So while you're breathing in, yeah. So I take after that, and then I studied speech pathology, so I go, that looks dangerous. That looks dangerous. That could be bad. Even though I've got them in a great Italian posture, we got a student who felt more tension in that Italian posture, so I have to gravitate away from it for that student. But for you, since you felt more open in the ribs and maybe you felt maybe a little bit more expansion in the Italian, it seems, maybe, let's say you did, then I would take you that direction. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Wherever you felt the most range of motion. So that's Dr. J. Everything else I've said has been voice science. Sound good? Good. Any other questions? We'll keep going. So last time we talked about these muscles. Everybody remembers the SEM here. What is the problem with the SEM? Why do we not want to see it? What might cause a problem, Joy?
It can cross over the CT.
Very good. And then what might that happen? What might be a product of that?
It could cause the tone to shift down a little.
Yeah, so a little flat. Yeah, it can mess with intonation. So if you have a student who has intonation, especially if you hear them at the end of a phrase, you might even see veins popping out of the neck. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, if you see veins popping, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have SEM tension. They could be very low body fat, and just like anyone who's low body fat, you see a lot of veins, right? You see bodybuilders, you see a lot of veins popping out of their bicep, and it's not that they're flexing, it's just that they're low body fat. So you have to double check to make sure that the SEM is actually a problem with low body fat people. Good. How about, go ahead.
What do you do if it is a problem?
This is for the next class. Y'all are so funny. Y'all are like digging in. So the next class is about what you do. This class is, should I have it or should I not? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But you can read my article, which talks a lot about this. Yeah.
Can you post it on the? I guess it's not.
I sent it out in August to the entire all of the students. Do y'all remember getting a thing like way back in August?
There's a very high likelihood I deleted
That's
it.
okay. All right. I'll put it on the Google Docs. Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Free copy
Thank you.
this time because you got the inside. Good. All right. How about geniohyoid mylohyoid muscles? What's the problem? Why do we not want to see that pulsing? Go ahead, Joy.
They tamper with the vibrato.
Absolutely. So I actually just taught a lesson to a prospective grad who had it, and we got it to release in one lesson, and she was like, "Oh, I've never felt my vibrato like this before," and it's centralized. Yeah, but she's had pulsing most of her life underneath her jaw. Yeah. Good. How about, did we get to the splenius capitis? I don't think we did last time. So this is the muscle in the back of the neck. Generally, the further we get away from that CT muscle with tension, the better, okay? Now, SEM tension, especially, we've got a good number, 3 MT singers in here. You're classical, right? You're performance. So in MT, they have you dancing a lot, yeah? And the muscles of the neck, including the SEM, are part of a group of muscles that we call rib raisers. So you've seen at the end of your dance routine, you get to the end, you're smiling, and you go, ah! And we see that whole thing with the shoulders. That's because of these muscles of the neck trying to lift up the cavity, the thoracic cavity, to get more air. So it can be a real thing that starts to ingrain in a lot of our MT singers because they're dancing around, they're super active, and we're asking a lot of their respiratory system. We're like, hey, sing a 12-bar phrase and dance and do the Charleston. You know what I mean? Like, let's do jumping jacks for 15 minutes and sing perfectly. Yeah, so that's what we're asking of them. And they have to be extra, extra cautious that these muscles don't start to get active in their singing. Go ahead.
Do they actually help get more oxygen in?
What do you mean?
Well, you're saying the reason why they activate it is to attempt to get more...
Yeah, they can because they're trying to lift the whole thing and dilate it. So it's the equivalent of, you know, our, it's like survival instincts, like when we were once cavemen and running away from bears. You know what I mean? There's this instinct for the abdominals to lock and for the air to try to dilate in this region. And unfortunately, that can lead to all kinds of problems with the neck. So we have to diminish it as much as possible in our singers, okay? But we might see in an MT singer a fast breath where the SEM grabbed, and that's okay because they're dancing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As long as we don't see it sustained tension throughout their singing, that's when it becomes a real problem. Yeah. But you can see how it might lead to that if you're physically exerting so much energy while you're trying to sing at the same time. Yeah.
So that's the SEM and those two? SEM plus?
SEM primarily, yeah.
Okay.
We have these other muscles over here on the side. They're not great, but it's not as bad. Okay. And I don't want you to even think about it because I've already given you too many muscle groups to think about already.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that sound good? We're only going to focus on the muscle groups that cause major problems. One of those is in the back of the neck. Okay. And problematically, if our neck alignment gets off, we're going to talk about this more in the semester, it can really squish and mess with resonance cavities. Did everybody hear the difference in my speaking voice when I brought my head forward like this? Very rarely will you ever see a classical singer walk out on stage. It's time to sing. You will very rarely see this happen, okay? But we have seen young singers end up with a little vibrato. Have you ever seen that? Right at the end? That little vibrato is caused by this muscle, the splenius capitis, okay? So habitually, some of that neck tension can get in there, and we have to work to release the splenius capitis as we're singing. If it gets real bad, you'll start to see vibrato pulsing in any of these muscles, yeah, including the splenius capitis. So we generally want our chin to either, you can think about it this many ways. You can think about elongating the back of the neck, or you can think about the chin coming a little bit closer to the neck to make sure that that splenius capitis doesn't start to engage. and mess with the vocal tract. Yeah. For many singers, it can make a huge difference in resonance. I haven't sung much today, but we'll see how this feels. But so if I'm out here, did y'all hear the difference? Yeah, makes sense. Did y'all hear the difference in the resonances? Yeah. So just a little bit out for me, for little Johnny when he was learning how to sing, I needed somebody to say, on the edge of your chair, Johnny, long neck, okay, and finding that column of space. Make sense? So we got, what are our major muscle groups? We got the front one, SCM, yeah. We got underneath the belly of the chin, what are those called? Geniohyoid and the mylohyoid, yeah. And then we've got the back of these, was this the splenius capitis? Yep, very, very good, good. So that gets us into, finally we get there, region 3 of the vocal, and this is when we get into resonances and all of the really cool stuff, okay? So, when we start to sing, that's where our vocal folds are. You can see it here. And that's that glottis that comes together. I mentioned earlier, you chop off his head, we just get a buzzing sound. It's two little muscles coming together, that TA muscle, wrapped in a Disney princess glove called the lamina propria, and then there's this slimy thing over it called the epithelium. So it's a princess who dipped her glove in a swamp, basically. And so we got those coming together right here, and then we get sound vibrations that are sent up this vocal tract. And this is what we call the vocal tract right there. Everything that's in yellow, it's kind of like the body of a trumpet. How many of you ever heard a trumpet player practice without, they just practice with the mouthpiece? Have y'all heard that before? And then they take the body of the trumpet, they put it on. That's like putting the head back on the singer, okay? So we get sound vibrations that bounce off of these walls, and we have some control over what we do with these walls, okay? We've got a little lever here. We've talked about the soft palate, the velum, the velopharyngeal port. Generally, we work to lift the soft palate or close the velopharyngeal port so that those sound vibrations will travel out through the mouth and not get trapped up here in the sinus cavity. And I think in our first class we did that, right? We pinched our nose, we talked in our nose and out of our nose. There's that lever. We either close off that nasal cavity or we open it. So for my MT singers, sometimes you're asked to make a character sound, right? And sometimes you'll be asked to lower your soft palate. And I want to tell you here, there's no scientific evidence that lowering your soft palate will hurt your voice. So if you're trying to make a character sound and you're mic'd, then you can venture into lowering your soft palate for the purpose of making a character voice versus putting pressure here at the vocal folds. This is the Disney princess itself. Like, this is the king, the queen that we want to make sure is really happy and doesn't have any problems, okay? All of this is to serve making these vocal folds very, very happy, okay? If we start doing things up here that mess with this, then we get into problems. Hyperadduction, hypoadduction, vocal strain, polyps, nodules, all the things we want to avoid, okay? So you can play with lowering your soft palate a little in MT. The problem with it in operatic singing and in choral singing, and a little in MT, is that when we lower the soft palate, it creates noise in the sound spectrum. We call it a negative resonance because it affects intelligibility. And I did that in the first class, didn't I? Hello, how are you doing today? I'm doing just great. You having a harder time understanding me right now? It's because I'm letting sound go into my nasal cavity.
Sound like Kermit.
A little bit. There you go. So if I played Kermit, I'd be like, no, maybe this is what I gotta do. Yeah? So when I talk out of my nose, feel vibrations. Hello, how are you? Hello, I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Yeah? You're getting more understanding. Does that make sense? It's an intelligibility issue. So to think about. We also do things like lowering the larynx, okay? And most of the time, about 2011, the journalists thinking stopped saying low larynx and we started saying mediated larynx. Because some people were taking the ideologies of lowering the larynx and they were depressing and going way too low and straining these muscles because they were trying so hard to make this low space that they depressed it. So we started saying 2011 mediated larynx versus depressed larynx. But this is basically stabilizing the larynx so that it doesn't go up for high pitches and down for low pitches, but we're keeping the tube length the same. Okay, this is kind of important in your training, is to keep the tube length the same. Any questions about those two main concepts of resonance? We also have things like what we do with our tongue, how that might affect the larynx, how much we open our mouths, how much we close our mouths, that sort of thing. We can even stretch this region back here. It's called spreading the fauces, or the pillars of the fauces. I know that your teacher, Jennifer, teaches, she'll talk about the Y space in the back and stretching. That's a very old approach from the old Italians. And we used to think it was lifted soft palates. That's not the same thing. This is actually spreading the soft tissue that's right up here, close to the uvula. And we call it spreading of the fauces, or feeling the pillars of the fauces. Yeah? It's making people young.
Yeah.
I'm assuming it's young. Yeah, I'm just joking. All right, so any questions about any of that? Y'all feeling good? We're gonna have to come back to this because we have a lot of people gone, but there's a good video. So now we get into some really fancy stuff, okay? So traditionally, up until about the 21st century, we all learned this, which is called the source filter theory, okay? And this is that the vocal folds come together, they make a vibration, and then independently, they send vibrations up into the vocal tract. This is what the vocal tract looks like outside of the body. This is our body of the trumpet, but it's us, it's our vocal tract. That's what it looks like. And this vocal tract functions, in this theory, functions separately from what's going on at the vocal folds. So what we've learned in the 21st century, if you can believe we're still learning a lot of new things, is that these two interact. That what we do with the vocal tract changes air thrust and changes the way the air is passing through a tunnel. So if you think, if this is our tunnel and we go like this and put a thumb in the middle of that tunnel, it's going to change the way the air is passing through the tunnel, okay? And so then we came up with some different terms to explain that. So we have a couple different terms floating around, so I want to give them all to you. There's inertive reactance, there's resonance inertia, so basically just flipping those words around, associated with nonlinear source filter theory, okay? How many of you have ever heard of these before? How many of you have ever heard of straw phonation, where you sing into a straw? That's all based off of nonlinear source filter theory, okay? That when you sing into a straw, you're extending the vocal tract and you're changing the way the air is passing through your vocal folds. And for many people, they feel a release of tension at the vocal folds when they play with different straw sizes and extending the vocal tract. So here's one thing to write down. There's a scientific constant that long, slender tubes contain more acoustic energy and boost than short, fat tubes. Long, slender tubes have more acoustic energy than short, fat tubes, okay? So how do we apply this to singing? Think of first of the orchestra. We have a trumpet. You look at that trumpet, it's just about this big, but it has this long, slender tube that goes around and loops around once and then bells out. Then look at maybe a bassoon. By the eye, you'd look at that bassoon, you'd see that big instrument, and you would go, wow, that bassoon's going to make a lot of sound. Look at how big it is. But the problem is that the tube is this big, whereas in the trumpet, the tube is this big. Does that make sense? If you stretched out a trumpet with that wraparound, you'd probably get just as long as the bassoon, but you'd get a long, slender tube, not a short, fat tube. Does that make sense to everyone? So we put the trumpeters in the way, way back because they're some of the loudest for balance, okay? We can take that as a singer and we can start to think, okay, I need to get over this orchestra, or I need my altos to be stronger to balance how many sopranos I have. I'm gonna train my altos to extend the vocal tract, lift the soft palate, slightly lower the larynx, maybe even pucker out. We talked about the Russians with a little pucker out. That would extend the vocal tract and give them little boosts so that they could balance the sopranos and how strong your sopranos are, okay? How about I'm a Mozart singer and I got cast in a bel canto romantic period opera. How am I gonna project? Houston Grand Opera, one of the biggest opera houses in the world. They want me to sing Mozart in there and I gotta project. There's these little tiny people up there in the corner. We're gonna work on the vocal tract to get long, slender postures versus short, fat postures. So the cool thing about this, last couple things, is that Manuel Garcia, that guy I talked about earlier that went to the French Conservatoire, he noted with this laryngeal mirror, he was actually one of the first inventors of the laryngeal mirror to look at the vocal folds. He noticed that when singers were singing the E vowel, that there was a stronger pinch of the glottis. He didn't know why, but he noticed that the E vowel created this pinch. And this is applicable, since Joy wants to know, how do I use all of this stuff, yeah? The E vowel, how many of you noticed young cisgender singers, when they hit the E vowel, most of the time it's a cleaner, clearer sound. So what I'll hear, I taught 36 cisgender females when I was in high school. Well, I wasn't in high school, they were in high school. I was post my master's, and I would hear this. Yeah, and the E vowel would suddenly become clearer, and I was like, oh, I guess we got to use more E, yeah? That low head voice sound. Did y'all ever experience that, you loving the E in your low head voice? Yeah, yeah. Inverse is as well. For cisgender males and tenor bass voices who use chest voice already, when they hit the E, they'll often feel too much squeeze. The E will feel tight. They'll go, especially in a higher range. You hear that little bit of rise of squeeze? And that's this stuff, resonance inertia. And it's because the air is passing through the tunnel differently. We also have secondarily sound vibrations that actually take up space, yeah? So it's secondary, but it's easier to understand the air, right? And then we got the secondary thing of sound vibrations being trapped in a small space that reflect back at the vocal folds. So if this is like blowing your mind and this is too much, just start with a simple layer, source filter. They function independently. Iterative reactance, resonance inertia, nonlinear source filter theory, they function together, okay? Believe it or not, there are still some places where they're teaching this and they don't realize that voice science has moved on and this is what we believe. Even just a few years ago, I spoke to a student from Cincinnati Conservatory and they're still learning this and their teacher hasn't kept up with voice science. And we know that this is the last 20 years of where things have all moved, okay? So, lucky y'all, yeah? You get to know what science says now, and I don't have to fix it in my grad class. Does that make sense? How are we doing on time? Are we like right at time?
It's 2:49.
So let's just do a tiny bit of review to end the class. One thing to think about is that muscles can only pull, they can't push. So Joy, if you've got back of the neck tension, and you're seeing it pull, then you know if you're seeing the head move, then you're looking for a muscle that's pulling, and you're going to try to elongate that muscle. Yeah? Long muscles tend to be in less tension. Does that help you?
Yes.
Okay, good. Muscles are often named by their origin where they insert. So when we talk about the cricothyroid muscle, it's attached to the cricoid cartilage and the thyroid cartilage. So when you learn the muscle, you've actually learned two cartilages associated with that muscle. When we said the cricothyroid muscle, the TA muscle, the thyroarytenoid, that's connected to the thyroid muscle, sorry, the thyroid cartilage and the arytenoid cartilage. Yeah, and we talked about that arytenoid. That's that little triangular cartilage we've talked about earlier. What are the difference between adductors and abductors? Adductors,
Like they go in.
bring together.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
And then abductors pull apart.
Pull apart, perfect. What is the difference between, well, this will take too long, but we just talked about that, the difference between source filter and non-linear source filter or nodal reactants. The CT muscle is the cricothyroid and it's responsible for pitch. And then the TA muscle is the thyroid, which is responsible for
Register.
Very good. I can send you off into the world and be good. All right, I feel good in my life. Good job. Have a good day. These are all going on YouTube.